The Valori had served the galaxy for 10,000 years, and in a single day, the galaxy threw them away like broken tools that no longer had any use. High Matriarch Soyen stood on the bridge of her dying ship and watched the stars drift past the cracked viewport. Her 4 eyes filled with a sadness so deep that every Valori on the vessel could feel it pressing against their minds like a weight made of pure grief. She remembered the old days when her people had been honored and respected throughout every corner of known space. When ambassadors from 100 different worlds would bow their heads and ask for Valori wisdom. When her kind had helped end wars and heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend. The Valori were empaths, born with the rare and precious gift of feeling what others felt across vast distances. And for millennia, this gift had made them the most trusted mediators in the entire galactic concord. But then the change had come, creeping through their population like a slow and unstoppable tide. The mutation had started in the children first, and at the beginning, everyone thought it was wonderful and amazing. The young ones could not only sense emotions, but could also project them outward, sharing feelings of peace and calm and joy with anyone nearby. The elders had celebrated this evolution as a blessing from the universe itself. How wrong they had been to celebrate. The Galactic Concord, that massive alliance of powerful species that controlled trade and law and military might across 1,000 star systems, had watched the Valori children with growing fear and suspicion. If these creatures could project emotions, could they not also project fear and rage and hatred? Could they not turn armies against their own commanders or make peaceful citizens riot in the streets? The Council of 12, those ancient beings who ruled the Concord from their golden thrones, had called an emergency session that lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. When they emerged, their verdict had already been decided. The Valori were declared a psychic contagion risk, a threat to galactic stability, a danger that could not be allowed to spread. Soliane remembered receiving the news in her chamber on the homeworld, her hands trembling as she read the words that spelled the end of everything her people had known. Quarantine, expulsion, exile. Within a single galactic cycle, Valori ambassadors were dragged from their posts and thrown onto transport ships. Valori healers who had spent their lives helping others were locked in containment cells. Valori children who had never harmed anyone were treated like monsters and criminals. The Concord forces came to the homeworld with weapons charged and shields raised, and they gave the Valori people exactly 12 hours to gather what they could carry and board whatever ships could fly. 7 million souls had fled into the darkness of space that terrible day. 7 million fathers and mothers and children and elders, all crammed into vessels that were never meant to carry so many, all watching through tear-filled eyes as their beautiful blue world grew smaller and smaller until it vanished into the endless black. That had been 3 years ago, and those 3 years had been the longest and hardest of Soliane's ancient life. The fleet had drifted from system to system, sending desperate messages to every civilization they could reach, begging for sanctuary and shelter and just a small piece of land where they could rebuild their shattered lives. The responses had crushed what little hope remained. The Rithani Collective had called them dangerous mutants and threatened to open fire if they approached. The Sorvine Empire had laughed at their pleas and suggested they fly into a sun to spare the galaxy further trouble. The Makari Federation had simply ignored their messages as if 7 million suffering beings were not worth even a moment of consideration. Denied and denied and denied again, until the word felt like a knife that stabbed fresh wounds into Soliane's heart every single time. Now the fleet was dying, and everyone knew it. The food supplies had run low months ago, and the Valori had been rationing their meals until every adult walked around with hollow cheeks and visible ribs. The water recyclers were failing one by one, and soon they would have nothing clean to drink. The medical supplies had been used up treating the endless stream of sick and injured, and now the doctors could only hold hands and offer comfort to those who were fading away. The children suffered the most, and their suffering was the hardest thing for any Valori to bear. Because the Valori felt everything, every pang of hunger and every moment of fear and every desperate wish for safety that would never come. The emotions of 7 million hopeless refugees pressed against Solian's mind every waking moment, and even in sleep she could not escape the ocean of despair that surrounded her. She had stopped counting the funerals after the first year. Old Valori, who had lived for centuries, simply gave up and let their hearts stop beating. Young parents who could not bear to watch their children starve threw themselves into airlocks. Teenagers who had never known anything but running and hiding decided that death was better than another day of this endless nightmare. Solian had spoken at so many memorial services that the words had become automatic, empty sounds that meant nothing against the weight of so much loss. And still the fleet drifted on, because giving up meant betraying everyone who had already sacrificed so much. The navigation officer, a young male named Catherine, whose once bright scales had faded to a dull gray, looked up from his console with exhaustion written across every feature of his face. "Hi, Matriarch," he said in a voice that cracked with weariness. "We are detecting a signal from a star system on the outer edge of the galactic arm, and I believe there may be an inhabited world there." Solian felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten how to feel, as she realized with shock that it was hope. "What do we know about this world?" she asked, moving closer to the console on legs that trembled with weakness and anticipation. Catherine pulled up the data files, and his expression shifted to one of confusion and uncertainty. "The planet is called Earth by its inhabitants, and they are a species known as humans. The Concord classified them as primitive and unimportant about 200 years ago, and has had no contact with them since. They have only recently developed faster-than-light travel, and their technology is considered far below galactic standards." So Anne felt her heart sink at these words. A primitive species with limited technology would have no reason to help the Valori, and every reason to fear them. What could such a young civilization possibly offer 7 million refugees who had been rejected by the most advanced powers in the galaxy? But there was nowhere else to go, and the fleet could not survive much longer without help. "Send them a message," Solian commanded, her voice steady even as despair clawed at her chest. "Tell them who we are and what has happened to us. Tell them we are dying, and that we have nowhere else to turn. Ask them if they will help." Catherine hesitated for just a moment before his fingers moved across the console, and the message flew out into the void toward that distant and unknown world. The bridge fell silent as every Valori aboard felt the weight of this final desperate attempt. If Earth refused them like all the others had, there would be no more chances and no more hope. The fleet would simply drift until the last of them perished in the cold and uncaring darkness between the stars. So Anne closed her 4 eyes and reached out with her empathic senses toward that faraway planet, searching for any hint of what awaited them there. But Earth was too distant, and she felt nothing but the empty silence of space stretching endlessly in all directions. All they could do now was wait and pray to whatever gods might still be listening that somewhere in this vast and cruel galaxy there existed a species kind enough to open their door to strangers in need. Commander Yellen Vasquez had spent 20 years working for the United Earth Space Agency, and she thought she had seen everything the universe had to offer. But the message that appeared on her screen that morning changed everything she thought she knew. She read the words 3 times, her coffee growing cold in her forgotten cup, her heart beating faster with every sentence. "We are the Valori, a people without a home. We have been cast out by the Galactic Concord and denied refuge by every civilization we have approached. Our ships are failing, our supplies are gone, and our people are dying. We have nowhere else to go. Will you help us?" Yellen pushed back from her desk and stared at the ceiling of her small office, her mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts and questions. This was first contact with an alien species, something humanity had dreamed about for centuries. But it was not the triumphant meeting of equals that the old science fiction stories had imagined. This was a cry for help from desperate refugees fleeing persecution, and that changed everything about how humanity would need to respond. She forwarded the message to her superiors with trembling fingers, and within hours the entire planet was aware that aliens were real and that they were begging Earth for sanctuary. The debates began immediately and grew more heated with every passing day. Politicians screamed at each other in government chambers across every nation. News channels ran constant coverage with experts arguing both sides until their voices went hoarse. Ordinary people gathered in homes and coffee shops and city squares to discuss what humanity should do. Some voices called for caution and suspicion. How could Earth trust aliens they had never met? What if this was a trick or an invasion disguised as a plea for help? What if these Valori brought diseases or dangers that could destroy human civilization? The Galactic Concord had rejected them for a reason, and perhaps humanity should listen to that warning. Other voices spoke of fear and self-preservation. Earth was just beginning to explore the stars, and challenging the mighty Galactic Concord could bring destruction down upon their heads. Why should humanity risk everything for strangers who meant nothing to them? Let the Valori find help elsewhere and leave Earth out of galactic politics. But there were also voices that spoke of something different, something that stirred in human hearts like an ancient memory of who they truly were. These voices reminded humanity of their own history, of the refugees who had fled war and persecution throughout the ages. They spoke of boats crossing dangerous seas and families walking thousands of miles seeking safety. They recalled the times when strangers had opened their doors and the times when doors had been closed, and they asked which side of history humanity wanted to stand on. A young girl in Tokyo made a video that spread across the planet in hours. She held up a drawing she had made of stick figures with 4 eyes, standing next to stick figures with 2 eyes, all of them holding hands beneath a smiling sun. "They are scared and hungry and have no home," she said, with the simple wisdom that only children possess. "We should help them because that is what good people do." The vote in the United Nations was the closest in history, and when the final count came through, humanity had decided by the smallest possible margin to welcome the Valori refugees. Yellen Vasquez was chosen to lead the first contact team, and she spent sleepless nights preparing for the arrival of the alien fleet. She studied every scrap of information they had received, trying to understand what the Valori needed and how Earth could provide it. Shelters were constructed in record time, as nations that had never agreed on anything worked together with sudden and surprising unity. Food supplies were gathered from every corner of the planet. Medical teams were briefed on alien biology based on the data the Valori had transmitted. Translators worked around the clock to prepare communication systems that could bridge the gap between species. And then the day finally came when the Valori fleet appeared in Earth's orbit. Yellen stood in the command center of the space station, watching through the viewport as dozens of battered and broken ships emerged from faster-than-light travel. The vessels looked like they had been through a war, with hull breaches sealed by emergency patches and engines flickering with exhaustion. She could not imagine what the beings inside those ships had endured, and her heart ached with sympathy for their suffering. "This is Commander Yellen Vasquez of the United Earth Space Agency." She spoke into the communication system, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her chest. "Welcome to Earth. We have prepared shelters, food, and medical teams. How can we help?" The silence that followed seemed to last forever, and Yellen wondered if something had gone wrong with the transmission. Then a voice came through the speakers. A voice that trembled with shock and disbelief, and something that sounded very much like tears. "You are asking how you can help us?" the voice said, and Yellen recognized it as belonging to High Matriarch Solian. "No one has ever asked us that question. Everyone has only asked what we could give them or demanded that we leave. You are truly asking what we need." Yellen felt her own eyes growing wet as she understood the weight of what she was hearing. These beings had been rejected so many times that simple kindness felt like a miracle to them. "Yes," she replied, putting every ounce of warmth and sincerity into her words. "We are asking. Please tell us what your people need, and we will do everything in our power to provide it." On the bridge of her flagship, High Matriarch Solian collapsed into her command chair as tears streamed from all four of her eyes. Around her, every Valori on the ship had stopped whatever they were doing, their empathic senses overwhelmed by what they were feeling from the planet below. Because the Valori could feel the emotions of the humans, and what they felt was something none of them had experienced in 3 long years of wandering. They felt welcome. They felt concern and compassion flowing up from that little blue world like warmth from a fire on a frozen night. They felt curiosity without fear, sympathy without suspicion, and a genuine desire to help that asked for nothing in return. Solian had served the Galactic Concord for centuries, mediating disputes between species who considered themselves the most advanced beings in existence. She had walked the halls of golden palaces and spoken with rulers who commanded armies of millions. She had seen wealth and power beyond anything most beings could imagine. But never, in all her long years, had she felt anything like what she was feeling now from these supposedly primitive humans. "High Matriarch," Catherine whispered from his station, his voice choked with emotion. "They really mean it. They actually want to help us." Solian could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The Galactic Concord had called humanity primitive and dismissed them as unimportant. The great powers of the galaxy had not bothered to study these beings or understand what made them special. What a terrible mistake that had been. Because humanity possessed something that all the advanced technology and military might in the galaxy could not provide. They had hearts that opened to strangers in need. They had souls that refused to look away from suffering. They had spirits that believed kindness was reason enough to act. The docking procedures began, and Valori shuttles carrying the most critically ill refugees descended toward Earth's surface. Medical teams waited at every landing site, ready to help in whatever way they could. Yellen watched from orbit as the first shuttle touched down in a field that had been prepared with tents and supplies. She saw humans rushing forward with blankets and water and gentle hands. She saw Valori children stepping onto solid ground for the first time in 3 years, their eyes wide with wonder at the blue sky above them. One little Valori girl, no more than 5 years old by human standards, stumbled on the unfamiliar grass and fell forward. Before her parents could react, a human man had scooped her up and set her back on her feet with a warm smile. The girl stared at him with all 4 of her young eyes, and then she did something that made everyone watching gasp with surprise. She hugged him, wrapping her thin arms around his neck and holding on with all her strength. And the human hugged her back, gently and carefully, as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. Yellen felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched, and she was not alone. All across Earth, people were watching these scenes and weeping with emotions they could not name. This was what humanity could be at its best. This was the choice they had made when they voted to welcome strangers instead of turning them away. High Matriarch Solian finally found her voice and spoke once more into the communication channel, addressing not just Commander Vasquez, but the entire human species. "We have traveled the stars for 10,000 years, she said, her voice thick with gratitude, "and we have never found anything as beautiful as what you have given us today. Thank you, humans. Thank you for seeing us as beings worthy of compassion, We will never forget this kindness, not for as long as our species exists." Yellen smiled through her tears and whispered a response that came from the very depths of her human heart. "Welcome home." The first year was not easy, and anyone who expected it to be was fooling themselves. 7 million Valori refugees could not simply blend into human society overnight, and the process of building two species into one community brought challenges that nobody had anticipated. The protests started within weeks of the arrival. Groups of angry humans gathered outside the refugee settlements, holding signs that demanded the aliens leave. They shouted about Earth for humans and warned of diseases and dangers and cultural destruction. Some threw rocks at Valori, who ventured outside the camps, and a few violent incidents made headlines around the world. High Matriarch Solian watched these events with a heavy heart, feeling the hatred radiating from the crowds like heat from a fire. She understood their fear because she had seen it in 100 different species across the galaxy. The unknown was always frightening, and her people were very unknown indeed. But alongside the hatred, she also felt something that gave her hope. Because for every human who protested against the Valori, there were 10 more who stood in defense of them. Counter-protesters formed human chains around the refugee camps, facing down the angry crowds with nothing but determination and homemade signs. Volunteers showed up by the thousands to help with food distribution and language lessons and medical care. Children from nearby towns snuck past security fences to play games with Valori youngsters who had almost forgotten what playing felt like. And the Valori themselves struggled with the overwhelming experience of living among humans. Human emotions were loud, so incredibly loud that many Valori could barely function when they first arrived. A single human city contained more emotional energy than an entire Valori world had possessed, and the constant bombardment of feelings drove some refugees to the edge of madness. Happiness and sadness and anger and love and fear and excitement all crashed together in an endless chaotic storm that never stopped for even a moment. Humans felt everything so intensely and expressed everything so openly that the Valori had nothing to compare it to. In the Galactic Concord, most species had learned to control and suppress their emotions for the sake of social harmony. Showing too much feeling was considered primitive and embarrassing. But humans seemed to celebrate their emotions, making art and music and stories about love and loss and triumph and tragedy. A young Valori named Tazara had been assigned to work with a human therapist as part of the integration program, and she thought she would hate every moment of it. How could a species that could not feel what others felt possibly understand the Valori experience? But Dr. Marcus Webb surprised her with his patience and his willingness to learn. "I cannot feel what you feel," he admitted during their first session, his warm brown eyes meeting her 4 silver ones without fear or discomfort. "But I can listen, and I can try to understand, and I can be here with you while you figure things out." Tazara had not expected such honesty, and something inside her began to soften. Over the following months, she discovered that humans had developed an entire science of understanding emotions without actually being able to sense them. They had techniques for recognizing feelings and processing them and working through trauma. They had learned to help each other heal using only words and presence and time. It was primitive compared to Valori methods, but there was something beautiful about it too, because humans had to work so hard to understand each other. And yet they kept trying anyway. They could never know for certain what another being felt, and still they reached out and offered comfort. They stumbled and made mistakes, and sometimes hurt each other unintentionally, but they never stopped attempting to connect. Tazara began to see her human hosts in a new light, and she was not alone in this revelation. All across Earth, similar discoveries were being made as Valori and humans learned from each other. A Valori healer named Orthan started working at a children's hospital, using his empathic abilities to sense exactly where young patients were hurting. The human doctors watched in amazement as he diagnosed problems that their machines had missed, simply by feeling the echoes of pain in a child's body. A human musician invited a Valori elder to a symphony orchestra performance, and the elder wept throughout the entire concert. She had never imagined that beings who could not share emotions directly would find other ways to make each other feel things. The music created emotions that flowed through the audience like ripples in a pond, and it was one of the most beautiful experiences of her very long life. Human teachers learned that Valori children always knew when a classmate was struggling, and they began asking them to help identify students who needed extra support. The Valori youngsters became bridges between isolated children and caring adults, preventing loneliness before it could take root. Valori negotiators who had once served the Galactic Concord found new purpose in human courts and peace talks, helping to resolve conflicts that had seemed impossible. When both sides could see that a neutral party truly understood their feelings, they became more willing to seek compromise. The first human Valori Friendship Festival happened almost by accident. A small town in the countryside had welcomed a few hundred Valori families into their community. And after 6 months of living side by side, someone suggested throwing a party to celebrate how far they had all come. What started as a local gathering grew into something much larger as word spread. Humans brought their favorite foods and taught Valori to dance to their music. Valori shared their traditional arts and showed humans how to meditate in ways that brought inner peace. Children played together without caring about the number of eyes or the color of skin. Elders sat together and shared stories of hardship and hope. By the end of the night, everyone present had formed bonds that transcended the boundaries of species. The success of that first festival inspired others, and soon similar events were happening around the world. The celebrations became annual traditions, growing larger each year as more communities embraced the idea of coming together. 10 years after the arrival, everything had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Mixed neighborhoods flourished as Valori families moved out of the refugee camps and into human cities. Integration was far from perfect, and prejudice still existed on both sides, but the overall direction was undeniably positive. A new generation of children was growing up together, human and Valori side by side. These children did not remember the fear and suspicion of the early days. To them, having friends with 4 eyes and empathic abilities was simply normal. High Matriarch Solian stood on a hillside overlooking one of these mixed communities, watching as children of both species played together in a park below. The emotions rising from that scene were so pure and joyful that she felt tears forming in her eyes. Commander Yellen Vasquez, now promoted to Admiral, stood beside her with a smile on her aging face. "It is not perfect," Yellen said, following the direction of Solian's gaze. "We still have problems and conflicts, and people who refuse to accept change. But I think we are getting there." Solian nodded slowly, her hearts full of gratitude and wonder. In the Galactic Concord, different species lived side by side for millennia without ever truly connecting, she said quietly. They maintained distance and observed protocols and never really knew each other. But you humans throw yourselves into relationships with your whole beings. You love fiercely and fight passionately and forgive generously. She turned to face Yellen with all 4 of her eyes shining. The Concord called you primitive because your technology was limited. But they missed the truth entirely. Your greatest technology is not your ships or your computers. It is your capacity for love, your ability to see strangers as family and turn enemies into friends. Yellen felt a lump forming in her throat. "We are just doing what seems right," she replied. Solian shook her head, a human gesture she had adopted over the years. "No, dear friend. You are doing something extraordinary. You are proving that the cold equations of the Concord are not the only way to build a civilization. You are showing the universe that compassion can be the foundation of strength." She looked out over the community one more time, feeling the love and connection flowing between every being in that place. "You have given my people something more valuable than shelter and food," she continued. "You have given us hope that the universe does not have to be a cruel and lonely place. And that is a gift we will never forget." The Galactic Concord could ignore Earth for only so long, and eventually their attention turned toward that small blue world on the edge of the galaxy. Ambassador Torvan of the Rithani Collective arrived with a fleet of 50 warships, each one larger and more powerful than anything humanity had ever constructed. The vessels hung in Earth's orbit like metal predators waiting to strike, their weapon systems gleaming in the light of the sun. Torvan himself was an imposing figure, standing 3 meters tall with scales of deep crimson and eyes that glowed with cold intelligence. He had served the Concord for centuries and had never failed in his missions. When the Council of 12 sent him to deal with a problem, that problem was dealt with swiftly and completely. His message to Earth's government was simple and left no room for negotiation. The Galactic Concord demands the immediate surrender of all Valori refugees currently residing on your world. They are to be placed in Concord custody for transport to containment facilities. Failure to comply will result in complete economic isolation from all Concord trade routes and resources. Continued resistance will be met with military force. You have 72 hours to respond. The message hit humanity like a physical blow. For 20 years, Earth had grown used to thinking of itself as independent and free from galactic politics. They had built a beautiful community with the Valori and had begun to believe that the Concord would simply leave them alone. Now that illusion shattered as the reality of their situation became clear. Emergency meetings convened in every government chamber across the planet. Military advisors presented grim assessments of Earth's chances against the Concord fleet. Economic experts calculated the devastating impact of isolation from galactic trade. Diplomats argued for compromise and negotiation. Some voices called for surrender. The Concord was too powerful, they argued. Earth had no chance of winning a military confrontation, and isolation would destroy their economy within a decade. The Valori had been kind guests, but surely they would understand that Earth could not sacrifice itself for refugees. Perhaps the containment facilities would not be so bad. Perhaps cooperation now would lead to better treatment later. Admiral Yellen Vasquez sat in the Central Command Center, listening to the debates with a growing sense of disgust. She had given her life to the United Earth Space Agency, had watched the stars since she was a young girl dreaming of adventures among the cosmos. She had led the team that welcomed the Valori and had seen the beauty that grew when two species chose to trust each other. And now her leaders were considering throwing all of that away because they were afraid. High Matriarch Solian requested permission to address the Earth Council, and her request was granted. She stood before the assembled leaders of humanity, her aged body frail but her spirit unbroken, her 4 eyes looking at each human representative with an expression of deep sorrow. "We came to you with nothing," she began, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "We were dying, cast out, abandoned by every civilization we had ever known. You could have turned us away like all the others, and no one in the galaxy would have blamed you. But you did not turn us away. You opened your arms and your hearts, and you made us part of your family." She paused to steady herself, feeling the emotions in the room swirling like a storm. "If surrendering us to the Concord will save your world, then we will go willingly. We have already asked too much of you, and we will not ask you to sacrifice yourselves on our behalf. You owe us nothing. You have already given us 20 years of peace and happiness that we never expected to have." Tears streamed down her face as she continued. "But I beg you to know the truth of what awaits us. The containment facilities are not prisons. They are death camps. The Concord fears what we might become, and they will not rest until every Valori has been eliminated. If you give us to them, you give us to our executioners." The chamber fell silent as her words sank in. Then something unexpected happened. One of the younger representatives stood up, a woman from a small nation that had welcomed thousands of Valori into their communities. Her voice shook with anger and determination. "I refuse to be part of this discussion. We're talking about handing over our neighbors, our friends, our family members to be murdered. How can we even consider such a thing? What kind of people have we become if we abandon those who trust us the moment the cost grows too high?" More representatives began to stand, adding their voices to hers. Outside the government chambers, something even more incredible was unfolding. Word of the Concord ultimatum had spread across the planet, and humanity's response was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Millions of people poured into the streets and cities around the world, and they were not protesting against the Valori. They were standing in defense of them. Humans marched alongside their Valori neighbors, holding signs that proclaimed solidarity and resistance. Veterans who had served in Earth's military stood shoulder to shoulder with refugees who had once fled the stars. Teachers walked beside students. Parents carried children on their shoulders, and the elderly moved slowly but determinedly through crowds that seemed to stretch forever. The chants rose up like thunder rolling across the planet. "They stay with us." Not one Valori surrendered. "We are one family." Valori in the crowds felt the emotions flowing around them, and they were overwhelmed by what they sensed. This was not the cold calculation of politics or the grudging obligation of treaties. This was love, fierce and protective love, from millions of humans who had decided that their alien neighbors were worth fighting for. Ambassador Torvan observed these developments from his flagship with growing unease. He had expected Earth to fold quickly under the threat of Concord might. He had anticipated perhaps some protests, some hand-wringing about moral principles before the inevitable surrender. That was how smaller civilizations always responded when confronted with Concord power. But this was different. These humans were not backing down. They were getting angrier and more determined with every passing hour. His intelligence officers reported that military recruitment centers were being flooded with volunteers. Factories were shifting to wartime production without being ordered to do so. Scientists who were sharing research openly in an effort to develop new defensive technologies. How could a species so primitive be so incredibly stubborn? Admiral Vasquez stepped forward to deliver Earth's official response, and she did so with a smile that contained not a trace of fear. "Ambassador Torvan, the people of Earth have considered your ultimatum and have reached a decision. We reject your demands completely. The Valori refugees are not prisoners to be handed over. They are our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, and our family. They are citizens of Earth in every way that matters." Her voice grew stronger with every word. "You call them dangerous because they can feel what others feel. We call that compassion, and it is a strength, not a weakness. You exiled them for being too connected to those around them. We welcome them because connection is what makes us who we are." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You want the Valori? You want to take them from their homes and destroy them? Then you will have to go through every single human being on this planet first. Every grandmother with a kitchen knife. Every child with a rock in their hand. Every soldier and farmer and teacher and artist who believes that some things are worth dying for." Ambassador Torvan stared at the transmission in disbelief. "You cannot be serious," he responded, his composed diplomatic demeanor cracking for the first time. "Your fleet is tiny compared to ours. Your weapons are primitive. We could reduce your cities to ash in hours." Yellen laughed, actually laughed, in the face of that terrible threat. Maybe you could, but you would pay a price for it, and the whole galaxy would see what you did. They would see the mighty Concord butchering a species that only wanted to protect innocent refugees. They would see us standing firm when everyone expected us to kneel. She straightened her shoulders and spoke her final words. We are not afraid of you. We are humans, and we do not abandon our family. So make your choice, Ambassador. Attack us and show the universe what the Concord truly is, or withdraw and leave us in peace. Either way, we will not surrender a single Velori to your custody. Not today. Not ever. On ships throughout the Earth system, Velori crew members and civilians watched the broadcast with tears streaming down their faces. In mixed communities across the planet, neighbors embraced each other as the weight of what was happening sank in. Humanity was standing against the greatest power in the galaxy, and they were doing it for beings they had only known for 20 years. High Matriarch Solian felt her heart swelling with an emotion she could barely name. Something between gratitude and awe and love. No one had ever fought for her people. Until now. The standoff lasted for 47 days, and every one of those days felt like a year. Ambassador Torvan's fleet remained in orbit, weapons powered and ready, while Earth's small defensive force positioned itself between the warships and the planet below. Both sides watched and waited. Now they're willing to make the first move. Throughout the galaxy, other species observed the confrontation with growing interest. The Concord had spent millennia establishing itself as the supreme power in known space, crushing rebellions and silencing dissent wherever it appeared. No civilization had ever openly defied them and survived. The pattern was always the same. Ultimatum, surrender, example, made. Obedience restored. But Earth was breaking the pattern. Those primitive humans with their outdated technology and their irrational attachment to emotions were standing firm against impossible odds. They should have collapsed in fear. They should have handed over the Velori and begged for mercy. Instead, they were broadcasting their defiance to every corner of the galaxy. In hidden corners of Concord space, beings who had lived under oppression for centuries began to whisper. The Kithari, a species that had been forced into economic servitude generations ago, shared recordings of Admiral Vasquez's speech in secret. The Morvith, whose homeworld had been stripped of resources to feed Concord Industries, watched human protesters filling streets and wondered what it might feel like to stand that tall. The Ireni, who had lost half their population when they questioned Concord policies, felt something stirring in their hearts that they had thought extinguished forever. Hope. If these humans could stand against the Concord, perhaps resistance was not as futile as everyone had been taught to believe. Ambassador Torvan felt the situation slipping from his control. Every day that his fleet remained in orbit without attacking was another day that Earth's message spread further. Every hour of delay made the Concord look less omnipotent and more hesitant. He had been sent to solve a simple problem, and instead he was creating a crisis that threatened the foundation of Concord authority. He contacted the Council of 12 for guidance, and their response surprised him. Withdraw, the Council commanded. Do not engage. Destroying Earth will create a martyr for every malcontent in the galaxy to rally around. Leave the humans to their foolish sentimentality. They are insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Without access to Concord trade routes, they will eventually realize their mistake and come crawling back to beg for readmission. Torvan did not agree with this assessment, but he followed orders as he always had. The Concord fleet powered down its weapons and began its withdrawal, each warship turning away from Earth and disappearing into faster-than-light travel. Within hours, the alien armada was gone as if it had never existed. Earth erupted in celebration. Fireworks lit the skies above every major city. People danced in streets that had so recently been filled with protesters. Valorian humans embraced and wept and laughed together, overwhelmed by the realization that they had survived. Admiral Vasquez accepted congratulations from her fellow officers with tired humility. "We got lucky," she said quietly to those closest to her. "They chose not to attack, but they could have." We need to remember that the threat has not disappeared. It has only retreated. High Matriarch Sulliane nodded in agreement, her ancient wisdom tempering the joy of the moment. "You are right to be cautious," she said. "The Concord does not forget, and they do not forgive. They will be watching and waiting for any sign of weakness. This is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a new chapter." But what a beginning it was! In the months that followed, Earth received transmissions from species throughout the galaxy. The messages came in secret, encoded and hidden from Concord surveillance. They came from worlds that had been silent for centuries, from peoples who had given up on ever finding hope again. They all asked the same question in different ways. Is it true what we heard? Did you really stand against the Concord? Would you shelter us if we came to you? Earth's answer was always the same. Yes. Our doors are open to anyone in need. The first new refugees arrived a year after the standoff, a small group of Cathari who had escaped their servitude by stealing a cargo ship. They expected to be treated with suspicion or detained for questioning. Instead, they found Valori waiting at the landing site with translators and hot food, ready to help them begin new lives. More followed in their wake. Morvith engineers who had been labeled troublemakers for suggesting their homeworld deserved fair compensation. Ireni families who had lived in hiding for generations, afraid to speak the truth about what the Concord had done to their people. Dozens of species that the galaxy had forgotten or dismissed or oppressed, all finding their way to that small blue world on the edge of known space. Earth transformed to accommodate them all. New settlements spread across the planet and onto nearby moons and asteroids. Languages and cultures mixed and merged in ways no one could have predicted. Problems arose and were solved through patience and cooperation. The chaotic energy of so many different peoples learning to live together created friction, but it also created something beautiful. Within a century, what had begun as a single planet sheltering refugees had grown into something unprecedented in galactic history. The Alliance of the Forgotten. 14 species stood together under a banner they had designed collectively, each one bringing their unique strengths to a coalition that grew stronger with every passing year. The Valori provided empathic understanding that prevented conflicts before they could escalate. The Cathari contributed engineering genius that had been wasted under Concord servitude. The Morvith offered deep knowledge of resources and economics. And at the heart of it all stood humanity, with their stubborn refusal to abandon anyone who needed help. The Concord watched this development with growing alarm. What had been dismissed as a minor irritation was becoming a genuine threat to their dominance. The Alliance was not just surviving outside of Concord control. It was thriving. Species that had been considered worthless were proving that their worth had simply been ignored. Ideas that had been suppressed were flowering into innovations that matched or exceeded Concord technology. And worst of all, the Alliance's message was spreading. You are not alone. There is a place where you can be free. The galaxy does not have to be cold and cruel. High Matriarch Sulliane, now in the final years of her very long life, was asked to deliver an address to the first full session of the Alliance Council. She stood before representatives of 14 species, all of them listening with attention and respect, all of them grateful for the path that had brought them to this moment. Her body was frail and her voice was soft, but her words carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. We searched the stars for mercy and found only silence. She began, speaking slowly so that every word could be absorbed. We begged the powerful for scraps of compassion and were given only ashes. We wandered in darkness for so long that we forgot what light looked like. She paused to gather her strength before continuing. And then we found humanity, small and fragile and fleeting humanity, and they gave us everything. Not because we could offer them anything in return. Not because it served their strategic interests. Not because they wanted power or influence or control. They helped us simply because they believed that kindness was reason enough. Tears appeared in her 4 ancient eyes, but her voice remained steady. The galaxy taught us to fear difference. It taught us that resources were limited and compassion was weakness. It taught us that survival meant climbing over others and caring only for ourselves. But humanity taught us something different. She looked out at the gathered representatives, at beings from species that had known nothing but oppression until they found their way to Earth. Humanity taught us that the measure of a civilization is not how it treats the powerful, but how it treats the powerless. They taught us that strength and kindness can exist together, that protecting the vulnerable makes a society stronger rather than weaker. They taught us that strangers can become family and enemies can become friends. Her final words rang through the chamber like bells announcing a new dawn. The Galactic Concord has ruled through fear for 10,000 years, and they believe their way is the only way. But we are living proof that they are wrong. We are the forgotten, the abandoned, the exiled. And we have built something more beautiful than anything the Concord ever created. She smiled, her aged face radiant with joy and hope. We will remember humanity long after the stars go dark. We will tell stories of the small blue world that opened its doors when no one else would. And when future generations ask how the Alliance of the Forgotten began, we will answer with pride. Her voice rose to fill every corner of the great chamber. It began with kindness. It began with humans who looked at strangers in need and asked, "How can we help?" It began with a single act of compassion that changed the course of history. The council chamber erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. And somewhere among the cheering crowd, Admiral Yellen Vasquez, now old and gray, but still burning with the fire that never dimmed, wiped tears from her eyes and whispered words that only she could hear. We just did what any decent person would do. We just opened the door.